So in this video, we're going to talk about how humans have impacted the environment and the negative consequences of that impact. Now, before we start to talk about some of the key factors about how humans have impacted the environment, it's important to understand the difference between what we mean by endangered species at the top and extinct species. So an endangered species is one whose numbers have fallen so drastically that this species is seriously at risk of becoming extinct. So endangered species are not extinct, it's just that their numbers have drastically been reduced, normally as a consequence of human impacts on the environment, and that can sometimes lead to extinction of that species. So at the bottom, extinction is when there's no living members left of a particular species, and that is despite extensive searches of the natural habitats for this particular species. So no living members left of that particular species. Now, we know current rates of extinction are rapidly increasing, faster than they've ever been before. Now, extinction is actually a natural consequence of existence. So different species do become extinct. It's just that the rate at which species are becoming extinct currently is higher than it's ever been. So why do species become extinct? Well, there's 9 main reasons. One is that humans impact the environment and change habitats. Now, that is linked to natural selection that we're going to look at on the next slide. So quite often natural selection can't give rise to beneficial characteristics that suit the rapidly altered environment or habitat. So these individuals tend to die off. We'll then talk about what we call non-contiguous populations, and this just means the isolation of smaller populations of a species away from each other. Now, if you isolate species into smaller populations and prevent interbreeding, it means that there's less gene flow between the isolated populations. So that can result in reduced genetic health of the population. Because it's a small population, so a lot of the alleles tend to become more frequent in the small population. We know humans can impact different habitats through things like deforestation, and that is going to destroy, when the trees are felled or chopped down, many different habitats, not just for animals such as birds and mammals, but also for small animals like insects. Now, we'll then talk about drainage of wetlands, and that is essentially the loss of habitats from areas surrounding lakes and ponds and the surrounding seas, marshland and pondland. Hedgerow loss, again, is another specific type of loss of habitat. So hedgerows are things like the bushes that separate fields into specific areas. And when these are chopped down to make way for bigger farmland, it can also result in a loss of habitat. We'll then talk about the crop growing season. So quite often crop plants are now being grown earlier in autumn as opposed to maybe in the spring. And that can also impact on population numbers. Overhunting obviously has a big impact on the population numbers. If a species is overhunted and it's not reproducing at a sufficient rate, it means that population numbers will decrease. We'll then look at competition from introduced species. So this nice example will be the red squirrel versus the introduced grey squirrel. Now, the grey squirrel could outcompete the red squirrel, and therefore the red squirrel did suffer and its numbers dropped dramatically. Now, number 9 at the bottom, we will then talk about man-made pollution. So obviously humans have impacted the environment. There's many pollutants out there, not just from industrial waste, but also things like plastics that get into the environment, and they can impact on the health of individuals of certain species. So please do have a look at 1 to 9. These are how humans have impacted the environment, which can lead to endangered species and sometimes extinct species. So we know extinction is occurring at a much faster rate than it has ever occurred in the past. Now, one reason is to do with natural selection. Now, because humans are changing the environment so quickly, that changing environment is occurring at a faster rate then new mutations can occur that allow a certain species to adapt to the changing environment. And this is why some species are now being driven to extinction at such a rapid rate. So one nice example is the Yangtze River dolphin that we did find in China, otherwise known as the China River dolphin. So the key idea really, if we just look here on the bottom of the page, we know new mutations can give rise to advantageous alleles. An allele is a version of a gene. But new mutations can't occur quickly enough to actually produce characteristics that would allow survival in that rapidly altered environment. So the once established characteristics that would have previously been advantageous in the older environment, they now get selected against by the new rapidly altered environment. So those beneficial characteristics that once did exist are now actually selected against by the new environment. But mutations haven't occurred at a quick enough rate to allow new characteristics to evolve by natural selection that match the new environment. So these individuals tend to die off. So if we look at the Yangtze River dolphin or the Chinese river dolphin, it's this kind of beautiful pink coloured dolphin. Its vision is not fantastic, but this was present in these Chinese rivers for 20 million years or so. But the increased fishing within the Yangtze River and the increased presence of ships and steamships, plus industrial waste that was released into the river, these dolphins couldn't evolve quickly enough through natural selection to meet the changed environment. Now, most of the dolphins ended up dying off because they were caught in fishing nets, they were poisoned by the industrial waste, some of the dolphins were caught up in the propellers of the ships, and so basically their numbers drastically reduced to the point that they became extinct. So another example of where humans have impacted the environment is the establishment of what we call non-contiguous populations. Now the word contiguous really means continuous. So non-contiguous populations mean non-continuous populations. Now quite often if you've got a small population of a certain species to start with, the small population can be separated and isolated from each other into two or more smaller, even smaller populations. And this means that quite often the small populations can't interbreed with one another. So there's a lack of gene flow. And these really small populations, they have a reduction in genetic diversity. So the number of alleles or different alleles becomes reduced in the gene pool for these really small isolated populations. And that reduces the genetic health of the population. So these small populations might actually become more susceptible to different types of infections, and they also might not be able to adapt to a changing environment. So a nice example is the black rhino from Western Africa. Now the black rhino has been extensively hunted for the horn. So you can actually see here on the left, this is the black rhino. The horn is this not very nice picture on the right hand side is chopped off. So this black rhino would have been killed. The horn is removed. Quite often the horn is actually used in things like Chinese medicine, and it's actually made of keratin and calcium, various other molecules. So overhunting of these black rhinos has led to an isolation of the small population. So imagine these individuals in the middle of the population were killed off. We get smaller populations that are now isolated, and the gene flow is interrupted. The genetic health of these small populations is then reduced. So the gene pool is made smaller. And the genetic health of these individuals obviously then becomes reduced. Now another example of where humans have impacted the environment is the loss of different habitats. Now this might be a result of processes like deforestation, where trees are actually cut down or felled in certain areas of the world, such as the rainforest of Brazil. So the permanent removal of trees, for example, is going to destroy many habitats for mammals, birds, small insects. So a big mammal that's become extinct over the last sort of 50 years is called the Javan tiger. Now, its habitat was destroyed when the forest was cut down. It was also overhunted, and so there's no members of this individual species now remaining, so that is now extinct. The fourth idea is called drainage of wetlands. So wetlands are actually really important areas that provide many different habitats and microhabitats for many different types of animals. So we know wetlands include the marshes on the edges of ponds and lakes, low-lying areas as well. Now, when these wetlands are drained, quite often to make room for new roads, new buildings, or even agriculture, which can be crop agriculture, plant agriculture, or even animal agriculture. The habitats that are so important to sustain the life of these animals becomes destroyed. So, for example, the large copper butterfly is now extinct in the UK because of the drainage of wetlands to allow for the building of roads and new buildings, etc. So you can see here, this is the marshland on the edge of this lake, and the edge of this lake on the right hand side too. And it's very, very important because not only are all these habitats essential to the welfare of these animals and their ability to hunt for food and to reproduce, but also lowlands are really important to help to mop up a lot of the water in the lowland area to prevent excessive flooding when there's very heavy rainfall. So we know mammals, birds, fish as well, many invertebrates like the insects, they do get affected by the drainage of these wetlands. So the fifth idea is the removal of hedgerows to make fields larger for modern day farming. Now, since Roman times, fields have been isolated into small specific areas, and it was to really show ownership of the land and who owned each particular field. But these hedgerows are really important because they provide lots of different habitats for birds and insects in the UK. But after World War II, there was new government policy that allowed the hedgerows to be removed, and that made bigger open fields to allow more extensive farming with new, obviously, farming machinery. So removal of hedgerows, which have been used to separate fields for many centuries, allows farmers to now use large machinery on open fields to increase the number of crops that can be produced and therefore harvested. And we know it's got a negative impact on biodiversity. Now the reasons are, the main reason really, number one, is breeding sites for birds, wildlife, insects, etc. have now been removed. Also, feeding sites have been removed, and what we call wildlife corridors. So these hedgerows have many different ideas. So breeding sites, feeding sites, and what we call wildlife corridors. So these wildlife corridors would usually allow animals to move from one area to another. But obviously if they've been removed, then this cannot take place. Now another idea is that if you remove hedgerows, you remove these plants, and that might lead to increased soil erosion. So when there's heavy rainfall, it can wash away some of the soil that's been exposed by the removal of the hedgerow. The third idea is increased predation on crops by insects that would normally have been preyed upon by predators that would have lived within the hedgerows. So maybe birds, for example, might have nested within the hedgerow. These birds might be predators for certain insects, so they eat the insects. And the insects, they might have been pests on the crops, and their numbers would have been kept nice and low by these bird predators. But if you take away the habitat of the bird predator, the bird can't live there, and if it can't live there, the insects can increase their population numbers, which might increase predation on the crop. So the main idea really is the reduction of biodiversity by removing specific habitats that form breeding sites, feeding sites, and these wildlife corridors, number one at the top. So changes to the crop growing season have also had an impact on extinction rates. Now, one nice example is the skylark bird that we would have previously found in the UK. Now, traditionally, the seeds for crops would have been sown in the spring, so late March onwards, and those seeds would then germinate and form the seedlings, which are the juvenile crops. However, there's been a shift towards actually sowing or placing the seeds in the soil in autumn time, so late in the year between September and December. And what this has meant is that the soil has quite often been cleared of any weeds and the seeds from these weeds, because obviously you don't want to grow weeds at the same time as crops. Now, the skylark quite often did feed off the seeds from the weed plants, but because these weed plants were removed to make way for the seeds from the crop plants, the food reserve or the food source for the skylark disappeared. So because the skylark didn't have enough food, basically its numbers reduced so dramatically that it actually did become extinct. So these pictures here are the skylark. This is the skylark on the left hand side, and you can see on the right hand side its numbers dramatically decreased between 1975 and 1990, and then there was a slower decrease all the way up to kind of 2010 onwards. So it's now been classified as being extinct because its numbers were so low it couldn't reproduce, and every last remaining individual has now disappeared. Another example is overhunting of certain species. Now, we know certain species are hunted for trophies. For example, the ivory tusks of elephants. We know some individuals, certain species, are overhunted because they might be used in traditional medicines such as Chinese medicine. Now, the example that we've used previously, the black rhino horns, they're made of keratin and calcium, and they've been used in Chinese medicine. Now, one example of overhunting in particular is overfishing. So quite often fishermen will use trawler nets, and they basically extend down from the boat all the way down to the sea floor, and they just catch everything in the vicinity of the net. So not only do they catch the fish that they want to kind of sell on, but they also catch other non-target fish within the nets as well. So there has been a lot of conservation efforts gone into overfishing in particular and preventing overfishing, and these include new legislation being passed that puts quotas on the amount of fish, the numbers of fish that certain fishermen are actually allowed to catch. So you can see here, this is a trawler ship, a huge big net that will extend down to the seabed. Not only do they catch the target fish that they want to sell on, they'll catch many non-target species, and you can see here huge catch of fish. So new legislation has limited these farmers on the number of fish they're allowed to catch. This is the Pyrenean ibex, the Pyrenees. This was actually hunted. You can see here it's got big tusks, and they've been trophies for these hunters. So their numbers have reduced dramatically because obviously these animals have not been able to reproduce to keep the population numbers high enough to prevent all the individuals from eventually dying off. Now, another example of where humans have impacted the health of a population of certain species is introduction of foreign species that have outcompeted the native species. So we can see from these two maps from 1945, the distribution of red squirrels in the UK was quite extensive. So many parts of England and Wales and Scotland had high numbers of red squirrels. Also, most of Ireland did too. But by the time you get to 2010, on the right hand side, you can see this distribution has dramatically been reduced. So there's a couple of main reasons. From the 1950s, the red squirrels were actually hunted. So it's another example of overhunting. But also at this time was the introduction of the grey squirrel. So this originated from North America, and when it was introduced into the UK, it thrived. And that's because it's got a wider diet, so it can actually eat different types of nuts, etc., compared to the red squirrel. So the grey squirrel could outcompete the red squirrel for resources such as food. Now, the grey squirrel was also immune to a virus called parapoxyvirus. I'll put this down here. So parapoxyvirus. So it wasn't really affected. It had immunity to this type of viral infection, whereas the red squirrel didn't. So a lot of the red squirrels are actually infected with parapoxyvirus, and it's very similar to myxomatosis that you find in rabbits, and it's a very debilitating viral infection, and it leads to the death of the red squirrel. So there's been large conservation efforts to reintroduce the red squirrel into certain parts of Scotland in particular recently. Now, some of these red squirrels are now showing immunity to the parapoxyvirus. So hopefully this type of immunity will increase within the populations, and they'll become immune, much like the grey squirrel was in the 1950s onwards. So the last example of how humans have impacted the environment, number 9, is the release of man-made pollutants into natural habitats. So these pollutants might include oil spills. Now we know if organisms get encased in oil, they're not going to be able to survive. Another example is the release of PCBs. Now these molecules are industrial waste products that were released into rivers. Now the rivers wash the PCBs down into the seas and the oceans. So these have actually been banned in the US since 1979. Now, it's not just oil spills and the release of industrial waste, it's also things like plastic waste that started to accumulate in the seas and the oceans. Now, organisms like the seal on the left can get entangled in plastic waste, and this seal would not survive without human intervention. And on the right hand side, you can see a crab here. That's obviously been covered in oil, and that is not going to be able to survive either. Now, this graph shows the mean concentration of PCBs, these industrial waste products, in the tissues of different dolphins. So higher toxicity threshold is the line in red. So we can see the North Atlantic Ocean, the Northeast Atlantic Ocean, the bottlenose dolphin, the levels of PCBs in its tissues have already exceeded the higher toxicity threshold for both male and female bottlenose dolphins. So this is going to be highly toxic to these dolphins and might actually lead to the death of these dolphins. It's the same for the striped dolphin in the Western Mediterranean Sea. We can see, especially in males here, that the levels of PCB in the tissues, the cells and tissues of these dolphins far exceeds the higher toxicity level. Now, one issue with PCBs in particular is that they're non-biodegradable, so they don't break down over time. That means they persist within habitats and ecosystems, and also quite often they do get passed from one organism to the next organism along food chains. So PCBs can be very, very harmful to an environment.